Before the first shot is fired, before the first soldier moves, before maps are unfolded and speeches are written, the war is already decided somewhere else. Not on the battlefield, not in the air, not even in politics. It is decided inside the human mind. And the rule that decides it is so old, so quiet, and so invisible that most generals never realize they have already lost while still believing they are in control. Wars do not begin with weapons. They begin with perception, with fear, with meaning, with the way a group of human beings interprets reality and projects that interpretation onto an enemy. Carl Jung understood something that military history took centuries to admit. Conflict is first a psychological event, and only later a physical one. Armies march only after the mind has already chosen a story to believe. Every war starts with a narrative that feels unavoidable, a sense that this must happen. That sense does not come from logic. It comes from the unconscious, from symbols, myths, collective emotions, and unresolved shadows that are waiting for an outlet. When those forces are activated, strategy becomes secondary. Technology becomes secondary. Even numbers become secondary. What matters is who controls meaning. The psychological rule that decides wars before they begin is simple, but devastating. The side that fails to recognize its own shadow will inevitably project it onto the enemy, and once the projection is complete, rational thought collapses. From that moment on, escalation becomes inevitable. Jung called this the mechanism of projection. What a nation refuses to see in itself, its aggression, fear, cruelty, hunger for power, it externalizes. The enemy becomes the embodiment of everything evil, dangerous, and subhuman. Once this happens, compromise becomes betrayal, restraint becomes weakness, and destruction feels justified. At that point, the war is no longer about territory or defense. It becomes a psychological necessity. History shows this pattern again and again. Before major conflicts, societies experience intense internal tension, economic anxiety, cultural fragmentation, identity crises. These pressures do not disappear. They accumulate, and the collective psyche looks for a target, someone to blame, someone to carry the shadow, so the group can preserve a sense of moral purity. This is why propaganda is never just information. It is psychological warfare. Its function is not to convince logically, but to activate archetypes: hero, victim, monster, savior. Once those archetypes are alive, facts become irrelevant. The mind no longer asks, "Is this true?" It asks, "Does this confirm the story I already feel?" The invisible front is fought here, inside perception. The side that understands this does not rush to attack. It shapes the mental environment first. It amplifies fear in the enemy. It confuses identity. It erodes confidence. It turns doubt into a weapon. Long before soldiers clash, morale has already been broken or reinforced. Jung warned that modern warfare would become increasingly psychological because industrial societies detach individuals from direct experience. People no longer fight face to face. They fight abstractions, flags, ideologies, symbols. And abstractions are infinitely easier to manipulate than reality. When a population no longer sees the enemy as human, the psychological threshold for violence disappears. This is the moment when war becomes self-sustaining. Leaders believe they are directing events, but in truth they are being carried by unconscious forces larger than themselves. Decisions feel urgent, inevitable, righteous, and any voice calling for restraint is perceived as dangerous, naive, or treasonous. One of the most dangerous illusions in war is the belief in moral superiority. Jung saw this as a sign of possession by the shadow. The more convinced a group is of its own righteousness, the less aware it becomes of its own capacity for evil. And the less aware it is, the more extreme its actions become. History does not punish nations for having enemies. It punishes them for believing they are incapable of becoming what they hate. This psychological rule operates silently. No treaty mentions it. No military manual teaches it openly. Yet it decides outcomes more reliably than firepower. Armies with superior weapons collapse when their internal narrative fractures. Smaller forces endure when their sense of meaning remains intact. This is not romanticism. It is observable reality. Fear, is the primary currency of the invisible front. Not panic, but chronic low-level fear, the kind that distorts judgment. When fear dominates perception, leaders overreact. They misinterpret signals. They see threats where none exist and miss real dangers because they are blinded by expectation. Jung would say that fear narrows consciousness, pushing decision-making into primitive patterns. At that point, the mind reverts to archetypal thinking. Us versus them, survival versus annihilation. Nuance disappears. Complexity feels intolerable. And once complexity is gone, war accelerates. This is why wars often surprise those who start them. Not because intelligence failed, but because self-knowledge failed. The unconscious was ignored. The shadow was denied. And what is denied does not disappear. It returns, magnified, through events. The psychological rule is unforgiving. You cannot bypass it with technology. You cannot silence it with censorship. You cannot defeat it by killing bodies, because it does not live in bodies. It lives in images, emotions, symbols, and unexamined beliefs. The invisible front stretches across classrooms, newspapers, speeches, rumors, and private conversations long before it reaches trenches. Jung believed that the greatest danger to humanity was not weapons themselves, but unconsciousness. A society that does not reflect on its own inner state becomes vulnerable to mass possession. When this happens, individuals stop thinking as individuals. They think as a crowd, and crowds do not reason. There, reaction feels like action, but it is not the same. Reaction is predictable, and what is predictable can be guided, manipulated, and exploited. This is why psychological warfare is so effective. It does not force behavior, it triggers it. Once the invisible front is lost, physical victory becomes almost meaningless. Even if territory is gained, the psychological damage remains. Trauma spreads across generations. Narratives of humiliation, revenge, and unfinished business seed future conflicts. The war does not end. It changes form. This is where Jung's insight becomes uncomfortable. He argued that peace is not primarily a political achievement. It is a psychological one. Without confronting the shadow, individually and collectively, peace treaties are temporary pauses between repetitions of the same pattern. The rule that decides wars before they begin is not about strength. It is about awareness. The side that understands its own fears, myths, and projections gains a form of strategic depth that no weapon can provide. The side that does not becomes a prisoner of its own unconscious, mistaking compulsion for destiny. And this is the most unsettling part. Most people living through these moments never realize what is happening. They feel certainty, urgency, moral clarity. Those feelings are precisely the signs that the psychological front has already shifted. The question is not why wars start. History answers that endlessly. The question is why they feel necessary when they do. Why, at certain moments, destruction appears reasonable, even righteous. The answer is never found on the battlefield. It is found in the human mind, long before the first order is given. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because once you see this rule, you can no longer pretend wars are accidents. If conflict is decided psychologically before it begins, then responsibility does not sit only with generals or politicians. It spreads across an entire society. Every unexamined fear, every simplified enemy image, every slogan repeated without reflection becomes part of the invisible front. People believe they are observers, when in reality they are participants long before uniforms appear. Jung warned that modern humans are especially vulnerable to this because we mistake information for awareness. We think that because we are informed, we are conscious. But information does not integrate the shadow. In many cases, it amplifies it. The more data flows through an unexamined mind, the more material the unconscious has to reshape into justification, paranoia, and certainty. This is why moments before war often feel strangely calm on the surface and deeply anxious underneath. Normal life continues. Cafes are open. Trains run on time. Yet beneath that normality, the collective psyche is tightening. Language hardens. Humor becomes crueler. Dissent feels dangerous. People stop asking questions and start repeating conclusions. At that stage, the psychological rule has already done its work. Leaders who sense this shift often mistake it for unity. They interpret emotional synchronization as strength. But what they are really witnessing is narrowing consciousness. A population moving in one emotional direction is easier to mobilize, but also easier to sacrifice. Jung would say that the individual has been swallowed by the archetype. Once archetypes dominate, human cost becomes abstract. Death turns into numbers. Cities become symbols. Entire populations are reduced to a single adjective. This is not because people are inherently cruel, but because the mind under collective pressure simplifies reality in order to cope. Complexity feels threatening when fear is high. And here lies the quiet tragedy. Many wars are fought by people who believe they are defending reason, while acting from unconscious compulsion. The invisible front is not only about fear of the enemy. It is also about fear of the self, of doubt, of moral ambiguity, of admitting that one's own side is capable of the same violence it condemns. Jung believed that this refusal to tolerate inner contradiction is what drives societies toward external destruction. When inner conflict cannot be held, it must be acted out. This is why psychological victory often looks like moral certainty. The side that feels absolutely right feels unstoppable, and the side that begins to question itself feels weak, divided, unsure. But history shows a paradox. Self-questioning societies are more stable in the long run, while morally possessed ones burn fast and collapse hard. The invisible front rewards those who can hold tension without discharging it into violence. That skill is rare. It requires maturity, patience, and an ability to endure uncertainty, traits that do not trend well during crises. As pressure builds, speed becomes seductive. Decisions are rushed. Nuance is framed as hesitation. Silence is interpreted as threat. And once speed dominates, reflection dies. Jung would call this regression. When consciousness retreats and older, more primitive patterns take control. At that point, even peace proposals are perceived as traps. Negotiation feels like surrender. The psychological environment no longer allows exits. Only escalation feels coherent. This is why wars often continue long after their original goals are lost. The conflict is no longer about objectives. It is about identity. Ending the war would require admitting that the narrative was flawed. And for a collective ego, that admission can feel more threatening than continued destruction. The invisible front does not collapse with ceasefires. It collapses when meaning changes, when stories lose their grip, when enemies regain faces, when societies slowly regain the capacity to see themselves without mythological armor. Until then, the war persists internally, even if the weapons fall silent. And this raises a disturbing question, one most people avoid. If wars are decided psychologically before they begin, then what signs are appearing now, long before the next one is officially named? Those signs rarely announce themselves loudly. They appear quietly, disguised as normal reactions to uncertainty. A constant sense of threat without a clear source. An obsession with enemies, both external and internal. The gradual moral sorting of the world into us and them, where complexity becomes suspicious and empathy feels naive. Jung believed that the collective psyche reveals itself first through language. Listen to how people speak before wars. Words harden. Metaphors become violent. Political opponents are no longer wrong. They are dangerous. Mistakes are no longer errors. They are betrayals. Once this shift happens, the psychological terrain has already changed. The invisible front is active. Another sign is the collapse of inner authority. Individuals stop trusting their own judgment and outsource meaning to crowds, movements, or leaders. This feels comforting at first. Certainty is soothing, but it comes at a cost: the loss of personal responsibility. When many people surrender their inner compass at once, collective behavior becomes volatile. Jung called this mass possession, not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological one. An idea, an image, or an emotion takes control of a group the way a complex takes control of an individual. Reason does not disappear, but it becomes a servant, tasked with justifying what the unconscious has already decided. In this state, warning signs are not perceived as warnings. They are reframed as proof that action is necessary. Economic stress becomes evidence of sabotage. Cultural tension becomes proof of invasion. Fear is interpreted as intuition. And intuition, once elevated above reflection, becomes dangerous. One of the most reliable indicators that a society is approaching psychological conflict is its relationship with doubt. When doubt is pathologized, mocked, punished, or framed as weakness, the mind closes. Jung believed that doubt is not the enemy of strength, but its regulator. Without it, power loses balance. Another sign is the rewriting of the past. History becomes simplified, cleansed, or weaponized. Events are stripped of ambiguity. Heroes are polished. Crimes are minimized or justified. This is not about accuracy. It is about emotional alignment. The past is reshaped to support the present mood. At the same time, the future becomes apocalyptic. Catastrophe is always just around the corner. Survival narratives dominate. When a society begins to imagine the future only in terms of disaster or domination, the psychological groundwork for violence is already laid. Jung warned that the most dangerous people are not those who desire war, but those who feel morally forced into it. They believe there is no alternative. That belief is the final product of the invisible front. When alternatives vanish in the imagination, they vanish in reality soon after. This is why psychological awareness is not a luxury during times of tension. It is a form of defense. A society that can observe its own emotions, question its own narratives, and tolerate internal conflict is far harder to manipulate. It does not panic as easily. It does not rush toward absolutes. But this kind of awareness is uncomfortable. It asks people to look inward when instinct tells them to look outward. It asks them to examine fear instead of acting on it. And that is why it is so rare. The invisible front does not announce victory or defeat. It shifts slowly, almost invisibly. By the time physical conflict begins, the psychological outcome is often already set. Minds have hardened. Stories have locked. Roles have been assigned. The tragedy is that most people will only recognize these patterns in hindsight. After the damage, after the loss, after the realization that what felt inevitable was, in fact, constructed. Jung did not believe humanity was doomed to repeat war endlessly. But he believed repetition was unavoidable without consciousness. The unconscious does not learn from history. Only awareness does. And awareness always arrives too slowly, unless it is cultivated before it is needed. Which leaves one final, unsettling thought. If the real battlefield is the mind, then the most important question is not who will win the next war, but who is paying attention right now. Because wars do not begin with explosions. They begin with silence, the silence of reflection that never happened. When a society stops questioning its own emotions, its own certainties, its own stories, it becomes vulnerable long before it becomes violent. The invisible front is not crossed by armies, but by ideas accepted without examination, by fears repeated until they feel like facts, by enemies imagined so clearly that they no longer need to exist. Carl Jung's warning was never about nations alone. It was about individuals. He understood that history moves when millions of private inner conflicts align into one collective direction. No leader creates that alignment alone. It happens when people surrender awareness for comfort and responsibility for belonging. The psychological rule that decides wars before they begin is ruthless, but simple. What is unconscious will be acted out. If fear is unconscious, it becomes aggression. If guilt is unconscious, it becomes projection. If power is unconscious, it becomes destruction. But when these forces are made conscious, something changes. The spell weakens. The narrative loosens. Choice returns. The invisible front is always active. The question is never whether it exists, only whether it is being seen. Because the moment a society learns to recognize its own shadow is the moment war loses its psychological certainty.